Hello dear friends, today is September 10th, Wednesday. A lot of important events have passed in the last couple of days, and they are very various. It is not always possible to understand how connected they are, but I will try to explain to you now. Their importance, their connection with each other, and in the end it falls into the fact that apparently in the next week in relation to Ukraine, there should be, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, some important events should take place. Because the pause has reached the outrage and cannot continue for objective reasons. Sometimes my viewers ask me about you, and here someone reads, listens, if links listen. I know this for sure, now I will show it to you. On the 27th, in my 1000th episode, I had a very important thought which belonged to me personally. It was that Trump's strategic mistake was that he tried to build ties with Putin as a good relationship. That's his weapon, he don't have good relations with him. From here, he believes that if he has good relations, he can resolve the war's issue, as he promised 24 hours earlier. I've said this on the 8th minute, 8 minutes, 18 seconds. When Trump says he has a good relationship with Putin, it's a plus for him, an asset. As a developer, he fully believes that. But Putin estimates every person not as a subject, not as an object for developing good, great relations, but as an object with which he can achieve certain goals through manipulating this object. If this continues, Trump will continue to develop or try to develop good, friendly relations with Putin, and Putin only needs this. The fish itself flies to him in the network. If this continues, as I said, the Trump project on the settlement of war in Ukraine will not take place. In the video 1001, at the first minute, 3 seconds, I said, became Trump's obvious inability to realize reality. The strategic bet on his good relationship with Putin, which will be even better, is rootless and harmful since it is beneficial only to the Kremlin and fits its strategic plan. This was what I said on April 29. Before that, I had not seen or heard any similar thoughts from Western media. On September 8, CNN released a large article written by the main or senior correspondent of Telecity on international security, Nick Walsh. He is such a well-known figure. He has been in Kiev probably since the first hours of Russian aggression. More than anyone in Kiev was present, probably none of the Western correspondents. Naturally, the person well knows the situation, has gained rich experience, and is also a senior host and correspondent. What I mean is, I have always liked his reports. Here's what he writes. A catastrophic mistake in evaluating the situation from Trump was his conviction that somehow, thanks to his personality, he could convince his Russian colleague Putin that a peace agreement must be reached. This conviction from Trump, he believes. Nick Walsh was once a compliment. Trump complimented himself, saying he could achieve this through personal relations with Putin. And regarding Putin, since he believed that nothing human was foreign to Putin, so how about a friend convince another friend that bloody aggression in another country must be stopped? This was Trump's anonymous dream, and Nikolai is calling it a bold, optimistic, but catastrophic Trump mistake in evaluating the situation. Thank God they reached the truth, but first the reasons maybe they can continue to arise, but why? What's the point? I think it won't work, or we'll go away from the main topics. And this incorrect interpretation of the situation, writes Wall Street, is expensive for Ukraine, from a point of public destability and U.S. support for Ukraine, and the possibility for Russia to freely advance along the front line. But in the end, Washington conducted valuable and obvious lessons. Generally, what happened since Trump personally tried to end the war, or rather Russian aggression in Ukraine, to convince Putin of it, and as a result get the Nobel Prize in the end, it led to a situation where there was nowhere to step back to. Trump, the American administration, but primarily to Trump, of course. Trump could have been covered in different fake leaves. Like, come on for 2 more weeks, come on for 2 more days, or I can talk on the phone, or let's go together. But as I told you in the anecdote, well, dear, you're so smart, come on, come up with something else. But as I told you in the anecdote, and here we are, according to the article, the meaning of the article CNN is in a situation where there's nothing to cover, and dear, there's nothing left to come up with. Now, as Alj writes, in a global resolving conflict, meaning a war, we see everything in a rather sharp contrast. In other words, everything now stands in white or black light, and everything else, the cover, is gone. So the actors are, let's say, in a situation without semi-tunnel, without any tree trunks to hide in. I recently watched an interview, a short interview of one of the fighters, BSU. He gave a very competent analysis of the situation on the battlefield. He said that this small seep-through of orcs now through the Ukrainian quite cut line of defense, it happens to a significant degree because there is still green leaves, the so-called green, in the forestry areas through which the enemy in small groups of 2 to 3 people seeps into the rear of Ukrainian forces. But as the serviceman said, in a couple of weeks, maybe up to a month, the green will wither and their advance will end, or conditions for advance. Well, by analogy, one can say that the moment of truth has just come. Green is the so-called, well, I mean metaphorically. In this case, it is already almost full. Everything is covered, hiding more, giving way to sides. And first of all, here is the point. The point is the administration of the United States, hiding, is nowhere. As Valj writes, the practical result of these so-called diplomatic efforts to establish good personal relations of Trump with Putin is the dead end of diplomacy. Well, he writes Russia, but I think first and foremost Trump. It is now clear as the day that Putin, Moscow simply frankly do not want peace. And no spells of Trump can move Putin away from this position. Moreover, since some time ago, and we will track them. We will definitely point to you now when this broke out. So, the president of Russia is no longer trying to peace Trump, and the presidential envoy Pete Kellogg on Sunday, the last Sunday, correctly estimated these attacks as an escalation. Roughly speaking, this hides behind rather competent diplomatic statements from Nikol Valsh. In response to Trump's endless attempts to please Putin in every way, then in the end, well, they get tired of him. You know how sometimes a cold favoritist or a cold favoritist gets tired of his Visivite and says, go away, cold favoritist, or go away, cold favoritist? That's it. Putin doesn't even hide the fact that he doesn't want to play these games. For a while, he played these games. He sees that Trump is trying, he needs a Nobel Prize, so he tells him something, sometimes even comes to the meeting, so to speak, hoping that Trump would understand that he should make peace, but he sees that Trump isn't making peace. It seems like Putin just spat at him and isn't even trying to make peace or at least give Trump a chance to preserve his face. This is what Putin has been doing for the last days. Moreover, he has been doing it in a growing way. Without a doubt, this is an escalation. So to summarize, let's make a small note. What this generally means is the collapse of those promises made by Trump during his pre-election campaign. Do you remember he said that there are a lot of cruel dictators in the world now, and the West should handle them? So, gentlemen, choose me because I'm the only one who can handle them. I'm a strong guy and I'll show them no sign of defeat. All this is, obviously, an unconditional and unmistakably torture. In reality, he remains within the lines of, if only a little further, a step forward or half a step further, you'll find yourself the weakest president in U.S. history, the weakest in the sense that these autocrats were the first time in U.S. history that they simply stopped being considered presidents of the United States. And the United States and the great power of the leader of the free world will turn into a regional state and give its leading positions without a single shot. It just turns out that Slovakia, as it turned out, could not handle the situation. This has never happened in the history of the country. Next, Nikolai writes, during the time when Putin was tired of unjustifying everything, and he doesn't even want to do it, it wasn't chosen. Accidentally, Putin left the Peking-friendly atmosphere last week discussing Deathless with his main sponsor, Senpin. Then they shared a limousine. The two of them, then Putin found a limousine with Modi and Putin understood, that China wants to demonstrate its own bloc. That is, China throws a glove, by the way, I told you about it, what it meant to me. Beijing got up at full speed and threw a glove at Trump's face. Avovkin, the owner, ran everything for Putin, and in that situation I assumed that since the owner threw the glove at another feudal, Putin would have to pull his position out of sight too, and that it wouldn't be diplomacy anymore. And I assumed then that this is probably how it would work. Nikolsh notes that it was and continues to be, and indeed, but take, for example, this story with a whole group of Russian drones flying into Poland's airspace. This was just, well, a week or two ago. It was somehow hard to even imagine. Please, this is reality for you. This is a new reality, as the CNN writes, in which Putin turned out, and this reality hasn't happened in 2 weeks. He's already calmer that he can get the necessary money, that he can get the necessary weapons. I mean within the framework of reason, ordinary conventional weapons. He'll sell more oil and gas, he'll buy them, and if needed, everything will do. He'll even send 10,000 North Korean soldiers. As Walsh continues in his article, Putin now knows that he is not alone, and will not be alone, even if additional sanctions against him lead to a collapse of the economy in his country. This is perhaps the last unit, as they say, in the West's remaining hope of defeating Russia, apart from internal political turmoil. Meanwhile, Putin is effectively spending the time he's already earned. Ukrainian officials fear that Moscow's forces will once again prepare themselves for a final assault of Pokrovsk and could end up warming up near Kupiansk. A very important point continues to indicate that this new unit, made up of China, Russia, and North Korea, has developed a sense of purposefulness and dynamics of the moment. In other words, he's leading, he's on strike, the initiative is with him. And in that situation, Trump sees that, in fact, the ball is in his court and he doesn't know what to do with it. Europe has already done most of its work. She promised to increase spending, increased it to a significant degree. She promised to carry out the main burden of providing aid to Ukraine, and she is doing it. She promised to completely stop the use of Russian gas and oil, and by 2027 she's planning to end all of this. In progress on the face, they aren't sitting around waiting for the last call. As for Trump, there's some mess of thoughts and cacophonous nothings, often contradicting sentences. On Sunday, Trump threatened a second phase of sanctions against Russia, supposedly expanding tariffs against India and its introduction in China. But as he notes, the already entered 50% of tariffs against India haven't affected the situation in Russia. There's no use except for the ironic fact that Modi went to Beijing, got trapped in Putin's limousine, and close to increasing India's and Russia's oil purchases by 50% in the coming months. American lawyers like CNN have developed a bill proposing sanctions against Russian banks and those working with them, along with a tariff of up to 500% for countries buying Russian oil. There is something to be done, there are options, opportunities. And if Trump had done that, it would have put him in a position in a single strike when his unruly measures against Moscow would have exceeded the measures taken by his successor, President Biden. Trump has also allowed Europe to pay for the purchase of Ukrainian weapons, such as long-range missiles, from which Biden once avoided. The finance minister, Dissects, stated that future steps could lead to a complete collapse of Russia's economy, forcing President Putin to sit for negotiations. So there's hope. Walls writes, this isn't hopeless hope, you have to act, you have to do something. The problem is a couple of circumstances make this idea very difficult. The first is Trump's confused mind. You remember, right, the situation like the May wind, sometimes there, sometimes simultaneously in opposite directions. Another important point is that Putin doesn't want peace. It's already hard to appeal to Razum. Specific actions on the battlefield are needed. When the author presented the story with those cruise missiles expected to arrive since October, the notebook was with him. The author's general thought was this: the last 8 months have been wasted by the President of the United States in terms of Ukraine's planning and survival, and of European security. These months were spent on unnecessary whining in front of Moscow and on the breakthrough of the strategic transatlantic alliance, which Washington will still need in the coming decades. This is the lessons it's hard to disagree with, but the author writes, these 8 months gave a priceless lessons if it were necessary to master. The lessons, it's about understanding who is on whose side and what is really possible, what needs to be done and what isn't needed in principle. And that understanding where we are now, when the so-called metaphor green thingy fell apart, everything expanded to the limit, and in 8 months, completely useless work began, or the US president's flailing turned out to be completely empty. Now it's clear who is on whose side, the author deeply says, and I would say in the color of mystery. Now even Trump can't feed any illusions about whether, I'll remind you of the previous phrase, now it's clear who is on whose side. So, gentlemen, that's the situation. Now don't think it's all dark, it's just a clarification. There is a bad situation lost 8 months ago. It's lost to Ukraine and its supporters due to President Trump's actions, or without action, let's say. But there's also the positive fact that finally, the author writes, now everything is clear. I can absolutely agree with that. I paid your attention to the fact that the Fox channel is the most effective, an important propaganda tool in Trump's hands. In other words, the host people are literally seeing that absence of activity or completely stupid and unnecessary actions in Trump's statements makes Putin increasingly brazen. The people are already making this up, just like the Americans are. And the question is, who is doing this? This is some kind of six making ends meet. Compared to the United States, like, who's to blame? From there, people aren't even told it's Trump's fault. The question remains the same. Yes, he's rude, a Kremlin dogma now. The question is, who is and why he's to blame? Well, now the second situation I want to explain. Why is it really more dangerous? And thank God this goes on until today's elites. Because before, they hid their heads in the shrubs, making it look like everything was fine around. About the forming alliance, China, North Korea, Russia, for now, only like this. Then there are the Iranians. So far, there have been Iranians after the strike on nuclear sites. Let's pay attention to this alliance. What happened after the summit in China? Article author is an article published in an article reflecting Pentagon's military strategic issues, real clear defense. And the author of this article is Song Hyun-rae, one of the best analysts in North Korea, South Korea. He is from South Korea and in general in this region. He is probably one of the leaders of the United States. He is a science officer at the Asian Center at the Harvard University. The article in his article, The West Should Not Be Blindfolded, what is obvious. The point is, indeed, when this alliance of the three began to form, the main thought in the West, among the people who analyzed and considered themselves experts in this area, the main thought was the following. Well, this is not a complete military-political alliance. There is no agreement between them, no treaty between the three of them. That is, there is a serious agreement between Russia and North Korea, more serious than in the NATO map with its Article 5, where, in the event of an attack, the members of the alliance should gather and decide how to respond. And according to the Russian-North Korean deal, if one country is attacked or in danger, another should immediately come to the aid. And by the way, North Korea now, according to this deal, saves Russia. That is, this is the fall to a depth that is difficult for the Russian orc and beep to understand. That is, North Korea is now a scapegoat that protects the unfortunate victim of Russia, who otherwise would be the cover. Well, previously there was such a popular mood among experts, saying, well, there isn't a military-political treaty between them, so there is an alliance, so what is there to talk about? It turns out, as a major specialist in this region says, from such a point of view, it misdiagnoses the essence of the problem. The point is not that China does not want to be a partner, but is methodically building an alliance without a name, without assigning it officially to the corresponding treaty or agreement, a full international alliance. Pekin's entire strategy is to avoid formal alliance attributes with the same, with tough duties, while simultaneously receiving all advantages from such a gray alliance where all cooperation primarily happens in the gray zone. That's brilliant, meaning China has developed an alliance for a hybrid war in modern conditions. It's a hybrid, it's a manifestation of a hybrid war. So they seem to have it, but they don't have it from another country. They officially do nothing as part of the NATO-Ukraine-United States relationship. Parties take responsibility, others pay, everyone knows about it, knows who and what was delivered, or rather, when it will be delivered. And here, there's silence. The three guys gathered around the fire, ethnicized, decided, and performed. And if they're asked, "What are you doing?" they say, "We're not doing anything," and "Where are you?" They don't announce anything. This is a brilliant alliance of the times of a mass, hybrid war. The absence of an official summit is not an error, it's a feature of this alliance. It fully fits the fundamental principle of Beijing's foreign policy, no joining the Allies since the early 80s. That principle aims to preserve strategic autonomy, avoid getting involved in conflicts from other countries. But it also allows China to maintain maximum flexibility, simultaneously demonstrating coordinated actions, the author writes. And to this day, until recently, the narrative that the dragon, that is, China, inevitably wants to join an aggressive alliance, that is, not an aggressive, let's say, dragon, the author writes, he was a tractor, because he corresponds to Western hopes that China would remain a pragmatic game which can be separated from its more unstable partners. Remember, yes, that statement, it's not hard to fool me, I'm happy to fool myself. The story I told you about, people in the Pentagon are doing nothing because when they are asked, "Why are you doing nothing against Putin?" they say, "We're preparing for the conflict with China." And if they are asked, "What are you doing against China?" they say, "We're not doing anything against China in particular because there is no formal alliance between them. We just watch what happens, and when there is an alliance, we act with it." In short, it's a ticket to a complete silence, but as the author says, it points the other way. See, wasn't a passive observer of all this. He was the organizer of the alliance. He paid attention so that the alliance could be formed at the parade held by Kupkin on May 9 in Moscow. He didn't agree to it at the time. At this time, he deliberately announced it precisely in Beijing, took the initiative, and he, his organizer and godfather and all sides of this alliance received what they had never received before. Putin created an alliance aimed at achieving maximum results under the minimal responsibility of the parties, and all sides received what they could only dream about before. This summit, the formation again of this alliance, became an immediate existential victory for him because it reinforced his supply of military equipment. Now he is confident he will receive the necessary monetary resources and any other aid, and he has now largely covered China from, as he believes, the possible. So he is taking significant action, so he has opened a second front against, not only Ukraine but NATO, because forming this alliance now lags behind both the United States and NATO increasingly in the Indian Pacific region. Next, he is focusing on South Korea, seriously on South Korea, this country, the area of North and South Korea, since he can manipulate in any case on a friendly basis to Kim family, and to us, if necessary, strengthening or weakening that tension. For Kim, this was an extremely important option. Well, Kim was someone before that. He was a requester, walk in and asked to feed both China and Russia. And now, sorry, he's a defender of Russia. He's not a requester, just a lullabying. He demands new missile technologies in exchange for artillery shells, without which Russia is no match. Moreover, Russia is a living being in large numbers, without which Russia cannot free its so-called sacred territory. He is now an invaluable, neutralist figure. Moreover, his relationship with Beijing has improved. Until now, he was the so-called questioning neighboring, but now, well, first of all, a nuclear potential is raised. Still relying on the relevant resolution of the Organization of Non-Nations, he stood sharp, and now, on the last forums when the speech about the nuclear potential of North Korea came up, Beijing raised this question. Earlier, no, that never happened. Instead, there was an institutionalization of North Korea as a nuclear state, and now, as a nuclear state, providing such a large, serious existential help, Russia is asking support from China in terms of what Kim Jong-un needs. As for Xi Jinping, he and China have undoubtedly become the main beneficiary of forming this alliance, the author writes. The summit and the parade became a public manifestation of a deep shift in China's strategic position, which led to the conclusion that a deep psychological shift from the West should be announced. Peking came to the conclusion that strategic peace with Washington is no longer a vital goal. Now Beijing is actively aiming to create a new world order. Peace with another system with the US. With the West is simply impossible, and as the author points out, this is the most dangerous mistake the Pentagon and its allies can make. It is wrong to evaluate the nature of this challenge. If again we talk about the crisis as a whole, then the crisis cannot continue. If again to say that there is no formal alliance means it's the same as preparing for the last war. The threat is not in the new opposition to NATO and the newly emerged Second Warship Treaty. The point is whether a flexible, adapted network is being created or not, which acts, attention, within the framework of international law, using two-dimensional meaning and a likely denial. Here it is, a hybrid war. International law is still raw. I mean the law itself, yes, it's a rather raw structure, has a lot of gaps, contradicts, and there's always a way to screw up. So this alliance led by Beijing isn't here to scream Daloy or anything like that. In China, they're smart people. They see and emphasize that chaos and the danger of chaos across the world comes from Washington. That's why the rest of the world is convinced. Why do you need this chaos? We, the main supporters of stability in the world, are now supporting the international law, its institutes, and we are against those who try hard to break everything as the US president does, so come with us. You the psychological, political, covered-up basis for that fight, which is now developing at a much higher pace than it was before, and here are practically immediate positive results for Moscow, for Putin. The same publication, Real Clear Defense, publishes article by Dr. Stephen Blank, a world-famous expert on Russia's and China's defense policy. He points out that practically immediately after the China summit, China opened its own market for Russian energy companies, for example, for Gazprom. What does that mean? This means that Russian energy companies that were still on starvation rations on the monetary market haven't been launched, and they still do work. China also hasn't launched them on its yuan market. Gazprom almost broke down, indeed, significantly broken down. Now Russia allows Russian energy companies to access their IPO on the yuan market in China and get the necessary volume through that market. Well, they could get the exchange only within the yuan framework. They won't get Western funds on China's fund markets. And that's good because Russia and the yuan had a recent problem. So what is achieved this way? First, it's China's first clear demarcation. To this day, China has been following or been trying not to disrupt the most severe dragon-style sanctions against the West, limiting ties between Chinese banks and Russian enterprises. Now China openly declares to the world, especially to the West, that it doesn't care about sanctions. It allows Russians to go their own way, giving them money for development. This is the first. Secondly, it's Putin's real victory because finally this is a breakthrough. He will get access to capital, whether Chinese or Western, but still. And finally, largely, China will win. Putin is here, but China will win in the sense that now Chinese can buy off shares in the largest Russian companies. And these companies are also in a pre-infarct state, eager to gain yuan, hungry on the Chinese market. Naturally, they will buy off shares in the largest Chinese companies and be put under Russian control. This whole Russian sphere, American companies will be in debt, under financial and later under Chinese control. That's the skill. On one hand, they are fighting the West, but under the guise of West, China will now be putting under control the leading enterprises and corporation of the Russian Federation, and then it will come down to the cultivation of land. This is the beginning of the Russian business colonization by the Chinese. Then all this, as says the analyst, it's a proof that both the gas industry and the oil industry, to a significant degree, will be put under control, not just the company, but the entire industry. It will be put under the control of China, because these industries make up nearly the only consumer. I mean, even the CBR2 forces, the East forces, which have one buyer in China, and naturally that buyer will dictate the conditions of the work of these projects and their prices. And finally, as the analyst notes, this whole project will lead to the fact that Russian energy giants will increasingly be dependent on yuan, and in the end, yuan will occupy the leading high ground in Russia's economy. There will be a humanization and Chinesing of the Russian economy as a whole. Thus, the author summaries, China has now in its hands the engine of Russia's economy, gas and oil, and will make priority clear about its influence, even in soft form. And it's hard to say if Moscow will return to its former freedom of movement. China may have increased its influence not only in the energy sector, but in Central Asia and perhaps even in the Caucasus, thanks to Russia. These deals strengthen Russia's financial independence of China, since it is the only buyer. Here's a checkers on from under the sky for you. On one hand, it's a sharp anti-Western bloc that will wage a hybrid war against the West. On the other hand, it also puts its vassals under control in full operation, in addition to the fact that major changes have occurred recently in terms of the formation of this bloc. There are specific political shifts. For example, recently, the author writes, unprecedented joint Chinese-Russian military exercises were carried out close to Taiwan. So it was China that insisted on these exercises being carried out close to Taiwan. The goal of China was to show the United States, first and foremost, that in the event of a conflict, Russia would be on China's side. Russians first wanted to untangle the situation and conduct exercises further from this region. It didn't work. Comrades from Beijing said it carefully, while those from Moscow respected and said, yes. So under these conditions, all these signs of growing leadership, or rather, not only growing, but already unconditional, irreversible, for China, growing and close to Russia, have long been seen, and they crush the arguments of those who say the U.S. administration and Trump should concede defeat to Russia in order to try and pull it off China. This is completely unnecessary and basically naive children's dreams with absolutely no reason. The hope that once Nixon turned China toward the United States with the help of Kissinger, turned China toward the United States, now, quite the opposite, he's turning Russia toward Washington. It doesn't work at all. Well, what does the author summarize? What does all this talk about? It talks about the fact that he has been working 8 months on the foreign policy front of the current U.S. administration. Beijing and Moscow did not evaluate Trump's serious threats, they just said nonsense, to put it mildly. And here's the thing you can't say about his threats. Their threats in Washington showed the necessary results, showed the risk. But Trump's bluff of Moscow Peking didn't count. They don't count at least 2, even 3, the dictator Trump was talking about in his pre-election campaign. He wants to be considered serious, not only because they're afraid, but because he should be. There are other problems. I've drawn up all of this for you in pretty much detail. The problems Trump is facing right now. Now, briefly, there are other problems. For example, the last public opinion question. Trump, he believes that only 36% of Americans support his economic policy, which is considered normal. What does 36% mean? 36%, or rather only 2%, is better than what Biden had in 3 months before he lost the elections, or rather even less. This is October 2024, that is, before the presidential elections in which Biden was defeated. So 36% is bad, taking into account that Trump, he had the most important column, economic policy. He promised to make all Americans rich and happy. Next, literally yesterday, a scandal. Israel strike the object where negotiations took place. Hamas with leaders, Hamas and some others. And on those negotiations, a proposal or ultimatum was discussed, as it can be called, also by Trump, about resolving the situation with Hamas. Hamas should have agreed to immediate liberation of prisoners of war on other issues, how to resolve the gas situation in the gas sector. And then suddenly the strike by Israel. What happened? A strike on Qatar, not only on Qatar, but the target was stated openly. They say closely, if not on the Al Udeid base, this is the largest American air base in the region. It was Iran that suffered response strikes after the American bombardment of Iran's nuclear sites. There's the Central Commandment, the largest base, and there are rumors these negotiations almost took place there. Not only the Hamas representatives were there, but they were also representatives of the Qatari security services. 3 people in the Qatari special services died. One of the Hamas people, the oldest I think, had a son, one of the Hamas people, conducting the negotiations. That is, the negotiations were largely in the interests of the United States, in the interests of the Qatar. Qatar is the closest ally of the United States, especially with Trump's administration. He's the Carter who gave Trump this plane, the one that should replace the FOS-1. That Carter, together with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, became the first place where Trump went with his official visit after the presidential elections. How did he, later on, bragging, bring a package of $1.3 billion promised to these three countries to be invested? In the United States, in short, Trump personally has closest economic multi-billion ties, and suddenly, here it comes the question, and the United States, when Israel was about to strike, agreed with the United States or not. It turned out to agree with Witkov because initially American soldiers found planes flying toward Qatar in the air above the region. They called White House gave Witkov's orders and he called Jerusalem. And he was told that yes, we decided to strike, but he was told this after 10 minutes after the strike was made, after the missiles were launched. In short, the scandal, the representatives of the White House and the administration in madness, the main conclusion, even the allies of the closest United States now cannot 100% focus on the United States, even a country connected by billion, if not trillion, to Donald Trump, the plane can't rely on his protection. This indicates that Trump's authority is rapidly falling. And the last major incident is the Fearsing scandal. It doesn't end well, about the connection between Trump and Epstein. A new document appeared. Now when Trump asks, White House deputies say it wasn't his signature. He has another signature, but right there, a mass of people appeared with documents and checkages and other documents signed by Trump, that very time when that signature looks completely identical. The worst-case scenario is that an irreconcilable group of Republicans began to appear in the Congress, ideologically magicians. They openly believed what Donald Trump said, and now they think he's been personally fooled, and they decided to go all the way. So there are only a few left. Somewhere in September 27, there should be elections in one of the United States where a representative's room is supposed to be full, and there are reasons to believe the Democrats will win. And then the Democrats in the representatives' room, together with the Republicans, will have the majority to decide to compel Trump's administration to hand over all documents to Epstein's case, in short, to publish them. The administration is wildly resisting, as I heard in a recent interview with Congresswomen's Representative Melanie Stansbury. She's a member of the Committee of the Chamber of Representatives, which is just considering the issue and requires the administration to publish all these documents. She says that, apparently, Trump is not doing much other than this. He personally calls on all congressional officials and senators, lobbying them almost 24/7. He doesn't even have time to deal with a budget question, though funding for government operations still remains until the end of September, just a few weeks. The situation is critical, everything is cracking in all directions, and things could go back to that. Trump could have become the most unsuccessful U.S. president in history when the great power had given up its positions and a single shot became a regional game. What does Trump's administration do in a current situation? Look everywhere there's a failure, the administration and it's personally known for its tactics. In such critical, scandalous situations, you have to knock on negative information over other information. You need a large, successful project. On the internal front, it doesn't work at all. On the contrary, it's all dark here. Now they plan to deploy troops in Chicago. This whole matter is exhausting. It's clear to everyone that it doesn't work, that it's not a matter of decision-making. Finding good internal information to draw attention is unseen. A major foreign policy success is needed. After the attack against Qatar in the Middle East, I think there are curses heard. In other words, Trump hopes for nothing in the near future. Meanwhile, work is being done on, in the end, a solution. What to do? With Russia, there's an option. Today I'm reading my latest study showing Russia's economy is left for 12 months of operation in the current regime. After 12 months, there is supposed to be a collapse. In theory, this process must be accelerated. For that, sanctions must be imposed, and fighting games must include corresponding weapons for the Ukrainian armed forces. There too, the situation must be disrupted, especially if missiles and RAM supplies that we've been talking about must be rapidified. So, dear friends, let me end today's episode here. As always, glory to Ukraine and the armed forces. The enemy will be defeated, victory will be ours. I wish you endurance, courage, and steadfast faith in our inevitable victory. Until we meet again soon.